Mainstream Mental Health Radio with Dr. John Huber.
What do you think you are, crazy or something? Well, you're not.
We're on a mission from God.
News, issues revolving around mental health. Dr. John Huber, a mental health professional for over 20 years, the chairman for Mainstream Mental Health, a clinical forensic psychologist, and a psychology professor at Texas State University. Breaking the silence of mental health, one day at a time, discussing the human condition, providing a sounding board for mental health issues, and making mental health mainstream.
You got a gift, my friend.
Now it's time for Mainstream Mental Health Radio.
Let the healing begin.
With Dr. John Huber.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Mainstream Mental Health Radio Show. I'm your host, Dr. John Huber. Thank you very much for listening, as we all really do appreciate it. I know we tell you that every week, but the truth is we do. We have another fantastic show for you today, and with everything going on, all the trauma that's hit the U.S. in the last few months now, starting with Harvey, through Irma, through Mandalay Bay, through the fires in Montana and California, we have a special guest today who's going to be talking all about grief and loss and different ways to maybe deal with some of those stresses and keep us from maybe experiencing that to the fullest extent. Remember to check out our website at www.mainstreammentalhealth.org. Let your friends know about our show, and you can listen to our podcast on iTunes at blogtalkradio.com, Mainstream Mental Health. And now for the news. All right, Instagram, another social media app, has had some research done, and what they found out is that some of the photos, if we get enough photos of individuals, they can actually suggest which individuals using Instagram actually have depression. We know that over 16 million American adults suffer from at least one major depressive disorder every year. And it makes sense that if, we know that social media apps are associated with depression and mental health issues, why not try to use them to see if we can help identify and maybe get the word out and some help for some of these people. So the study took nearly 44,000 photographs from subjects' Instagram pages and ran them through computer algorithms, and they looked for markers of depression within facial characteristics. They also looked at other things like color choices that the Instagram users chose to make in their presentations and pictures. The analysis found out that those who were depressed were more likely to post colors or bluer colors, darker and grayer photographs, but they were more likely to show human faces but show less of their own face. They also found out that they tended to not use Instagram filters to adjust the photos' brightness and coloring and, those little fun things they put on there like bunny rabbit ears and stuff like that. The use of Inkwell black and white filters, when they did use filters, they also identified that they did not use the Valencia filter that actually lightens the tint of the photos. Now, some of the other things they found out that these individuals who tended to be flagged as meeting these criteria for depression also tended to post more frequently and had more comments on their posts, but also had fewer likes. So people responded and commented, but they didn't necessarily like the photograph. And these predicted results actually were better than general practitioners' diagnostic success rates, and they held up even when the analysis was done only on posts made before depressed individuals were first diagnosed. So a really interesting study. I think it's good that social media is actually stepping up to the plate, and maybe we can help utilize the social media that we know is somehow enmeshed with depression and mental health issues. Authorities in Texas have arrested a parent that was seen in a video pummeling a teen girl on high school property. Mary Alice Hernandez, 34, was arrested and charged with assault causing bodily injury on Monday in Corpus Christi after the disturbing footage filmed at Miller High School went viral. according to the Corpus Christi Caller-Times. And, you know, I'm from Texas, and a lot of our listeners are from Texas. I also was down in Corpus not 2 weeks ago, and I don't necessarily think that there's anything in particular about that. I think that's just where it happened. So looking at that, I think this could happen pretty much anywhere. But what I think is interesting is that the video, it was actually captured on a cell phone, then showed the actual assault, the suspect repeatedly striking the student in the head October 18th before Mary Alice Hernandez, 34, actually left. And the arrest came after the student's mom made a plea on Facebook for help tracking down this woman. Now, this was not the student's parent. This was a parent who was on campus who assaulted somebody else's child. So just something to think about, and realize that cameras are everywhere and bad behavior is everywhere, and sometimes they'll catch up with you. All right. We got a wonderful event coming up here. A lot of people don't like Halloween. A lot of people love Halloween. A lot of people like all the scariness and spookiness around Halloween. Some people think it's blasphemous. But the reality of it is, in the entertainment world, Halloween is a big score. We're able to get people into movie theaters to get shocked and horrified. So the question is, can horror films cause post-traumatic stress disorder? And if we think about it, what are you doing? You're observing someone else experience trauma. And we know that in real life, when you observe somebody else experience trauma, you can actually get post-traumatic stress disorder. You can suffer from depression, from guilt. There's a lot of things that can go on there. So it makes sense that you actually can. And what they've done is, and the whole purpose of this was to look at horror films and see what their intentional purpose is. And it is to scare the audience, keep you on the edge of your seat. However, everybody experiences different processes, different stimuli, different. And some viewers may be traumatized while other people may be excited. There may be part of them in there that sees that this is not reality. But if you're a child, if you're a young person, a young adult, your brain still hasn't formally developed thoroughly. And there's a possibility that you can actually be traumatized by this and experience post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, I know some adults who cannot watch horror movies, and when their spouse watches them, they tell them so they can leave the room, or they look away and don't actually watch the horror that happens. You know, but children with their developing brains can be in a place where the lines between imagination and reality are blurred. And when a child witnesses graphic gore or murder on a horror film, they can actually experience that trauma. And that trauma could potentially affect them the rest of their lives. And it's kind of a scary thing to realize is out there. And for individuals who are survivors of assault, sexual abuse, attempted murder, even, you know, car accidents and things that create scenes of horror, certain horror films themselves may actually trigger them and further intensify their own post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you want to hear more about this, I'd recommend that you tune into Jenny McCarthy's show on XM 109 on Tuesday, and I'll be a guest on her show, and we'll be talking about this topic right here a little bit more thoroughly than what we're going over today. Just a reminder, you're listening to Mainstream Mental Health Radio. I'm your host, Dr. John Huber. And what do we know about depression? Well, we know depression is linked to higher long-term risk for early death in both women and men. And as much as we like to think that women experience depression twice as much as men do, I think the reality of it is in our society, men can't talk about those things. So I think this is a very pronounced study here. And what we've seen is even though we have an increased awareness about mental health, we have a long way to go. But even though we've increased that over the years, depression remains strongly linked to these early risks of early death. And this risk is increased for women in most recent years. And this is according to a study that is actually taken place over 60 years, a Sterling County study published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. There's actually less stigma associated with depression, and better treatments are now available today than when the study started, but depression's link to mortality is still here, and it's right there in everybody's face. Dr. Stephen Gilman of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, part of the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, says, at first the association was just limited to men, but in later years it was seen more and more for women as well. Now, the Sterling County study began in 1952 in Atlantic Canada, and it's well known internationally as one of the first community-based studies on mental health. A researcher from the original study, Dr. Jane Murphy, with Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School in Boston, Mass., is the co-author on this latest research. And what we see is that this international team of researchers looked at 60 years of mental health data on over 3,410 adults during three periods, 1952 to 1967, 1968 to 1990, and 1991 to 2011 from this region here in Atlantic Canada, and linked the data to the deaths in Canadian mortality databases. And they found that the link between depression and an increased risk of death was observed in all decades of the study among men, whereas it emerged among women beginning in the 1990s. So this risk of death associated with depression appeared strongest in the years following a depressive episode, leading the authors to speculate that this risk could be reversed by achieving remission of depression. And it may be telling us some other things, too. One of the reasons why it tends to be underreported in men is we tend to internalize things and try to take care of it themselves until it gets so bad that we do take physical action, and that includes suicide attempts. And maybe women now are less likely or somehow not willing to share their information as much. And that may be pushing them to do something physical instead of sitting down and talking with somebody and sharing. So I think this has some startling implications, but I also think it's great that we have this going on. And we need to study early processes leading up to depression in all types of mental health, because I think early identification, early intervention is going to be the key to long-term reductions in mental health issues across the world, not just in the United States, much like we found that early identification of breast cancer, prostate cancer, and colon cancer is a significant way to actually decrease the fatalities due to those cancers. Again, I'd like to remind you, you're listening to Mainstream Mental Health Radio Show. My name is Dr. John Huber. We have a special guest today, Sabrina Must, and she has some insights. She's had to deal with some personal tragedy. In particular, she had a sister who committed suicide, and she's had to process through that. And I know as a professional therapist and psychologist, I have worked with individuals who've had to deal with it. I've worked with individuals who failed and attempted suicide. And, you know, that's all good and fine from a technical, clinical perspective, but from a real-life person who doesn't have any training, I think that after I've read several chapters out of her book, which we'll talk about here soon, I think she has some really compelling and insightful perspectives that I think would be very beneficial to our listeners if you've ever had the opportunity to have to deal with that. So today I'd like to welcome Sabrina Must to our show. Sabrina, thank you for coming on.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm blushing over here. I didn't realize we were gonna talk so deeply about the book, but yeah, unfortunately, it's not always the most quote unquote fun topic, but it's very important and something that I do feel, you know, we can make some light of and feel more connected talking about it. So, yeah.
Definitely. Well, and if there's other things you'd like to talk about, I'm fair for that. I don't have a problem with that. I just I've had access to your book and have been reading it, and I think it's very insightful. And it must have been a catharsis to write it, and a struggle to write it, but at the same time, you did a beautiful job.
Well, thank you. Yeah, definitely very cathartic, very, very challenging emotionally, and yet probably the best way that I could have grieved, just because I kind of put it all out there, and it kind of forced me to deal with some of the emotions, that's for sure. So, yeah.
Well, tell me a little bit. My listeners haven't read your book yet, so can you give them a little synopsis of, what happened when you found out and the process, to get them kind of up to speed?
Absolutely. So the book's called Must Girls Love. I'm the youngest of 4 sisters. My sister Miya committed suicide. It'll actually be 10 years on November 14th, back in 2007. The phrase Must Girls Love was really just kind of a phrase that we used as a family, about just like sisterly love, family love. And Miya committed suicide. She was in a pretty abusive marriage, mostly not married for very long. I was just about to turn 22, maybe a couple exams away from finishing my bachelor's degree, and basically spent the first year after she killed herself pretty obsessively working on this book. Didn't really plan to write it. It just kind of like happened. And it details almost that entire first year, but goes a lot into the history of understanding my sister. She was bipolar, very together, very balanced. That's definitely something I struggle with in the book, because very easy if someone's, depressed or bipolar, or you have a label on someone, you just say, oh, that's why they killed themselves. And that was very far from it. So it's a lot of discussion on mental illness, understanding it, how that plays a part in someone's happiness or depression, and understanding my sister and trying to understand how I felt about the whole experience. It still has a feel of it still has some uplifting parts, obviously, because it talks about, I was very close with my sister, a lot of beautiful moments, but it does. I wanted a very raw, this is really what happens. It's not pretty. Most people kind of shy away from being around that time. When you lose someone that suddenly, people are kind of around for the first, week, month, and then they kind of disappear and go back to their lives. And I wanted someone that has never experienced it to really know what it's like, and someone that is experienced it and might feel very alone to then not feel that alone, because, oh, this is kind of quote unquote normal. I can understand and relate to what she went through. So that's a long-winded version of what the book's about.
Well, actually, I think that was pretty concise compared to, the book is actually relatively easy to read, but it tears at your heartstrings, and you said also it can be very uplifting. But one of the things that I always get from survivors, when a family member has passed this way, is it's like this whole feeling that everything's been dumped on them, and I think you kind of process through that with your book. And one of the things of Mainstream Mental Health, my nonprofit, is we want to talk about this stuff and realize, like you said, that this is kind of normal. This is not unusual. And the more we talk about it, the more we can get this stuff out, the better off I think we're all going to be. Yeah,
for sure. It's listen, it's not just with suicide. It's not just with mental health. It's with any human experience. It can be something like dating. How many times, we don't ever really talk about the heartbreak and how lonely it can feel when you're dating. People always want to latch on to like, oh, you're in a relationship and what's that like? And that's all fun. But there's struggles in it. It's struggles with anything in life. And not that, I think life is about being happy. So it's how can you take the things that, excuse my French, are really shitty, and then turn them around and try to find almost, how can I still find joy even though this really shitty thing happened to me? The book definitely really talks about, it does. It throws family dynamics off. Maya's the oldest, and then it's Brittany, and then it's Casey, and then I'm the youngest, and what role do you fill? And what, you're dealing with, well, how do your parents now interact with you? And it does. You kind of are you're left to pick up all those pieces. And in a lot of family regret and struggle and everything that was always kind of pushed under the rug, no matter how open and vocal your family may be, there's always those issues. And it just kind of it's like ripping a Band-Aid off. And you have no choice but to kind of deal with it. And that's a lot of the struggle, especially with suicide, because it's so sudden. And so many people have, regrets of, if I had done this, or if she hadn't killed herself, I wouldn't be struggling in this way. And there's just a lot of emotions that come up because of it, which can make people feel, I'm not doing this right. And there's really no right way to grieve. There's just a lot of, it is a lot of pain and sadness, but I do think dealing with it and talking about it is, no matter how you're doing that, whether it's writing or you're talking to a therapist, you're talking to your best friend, or you're speaking about, or whatever it is, it's still actually looking at the situation and trying to make the best of it.
Exactly. So, you started talking about your sisters that are surviving with you. What was their input when you were writing the book? Was there any? That was a big issue. My parents were my mom was very supportive. My dad really didn't understand what I was doing. He's never read the book. My sisters were very angry that I was writing the book. One's very private, and corporate, I guess. Didn't want this coming out. The other sister, we just weren't getting along just because we weren't getting along. And so the book was just kind of a means to just have one more thing to fight about. But then once she kind of read it and we worked through it, then she was supportive. So it wasn't that they necessarily had input too much in terms of what was being discussed, because it is from my perspective. But I did adjust some things just so they could feel more comfortable, as in change a name or leave something out. For the most part, I really try to keep it as, sometimes it's repetitive, because that's what happens when you're grieving. You go over the same thoughts and the same scenarios and try to understand it. And I wanted it to be really, truly, as honest of a portrayal as it could be. But there, it did it. Yeah. And I'm curious, after, did your other sisters read it? I mean, what was the reaction then after you wrote it, after they read it?
Yeah. One loved it, even though it was, a struggle. And one, to be really blunt, came back with, a highlighted copy with everything she didn't agree, which was basically every other paragraph. It wasn't, she threatened to sue me. It was a very intense, there was a lot of drama around it. But I was very, very hard-headed about, no, this is my art, and this is going to help a lot of people, and it's really nothing to feel shameful about. That's always what I go back to. No matter how scary it is to talk about something or share about something publicly, privately, with whomever, with your partner, with a stranger on the street, there's really nothing that I've gone through that someone else hasn't. And so I, with that one particular sister, it was I know this angers you, but there's just, I saw it very differently. So there's I was trying to be gentle about it, but still really believed in what I was doing. So I kind of just semi-ignored, you know. It was a struggle, though. And a lot of it comes back to like a switch up in family dynamics. You know, Miya would have been the one that was supporting me emotionally and, you know, and building me up, and she wasn't there. So it was like it messes up a death in the family, whether it's suicide or cancer or whatever. It throws everything off, and it's trying to kind of like reel it back in and figure out how can you all function in a healthy way again. So, yeah.
I think that's excellent, you know, the process that I see a lot of families going through. And I see a lot of, believe it or not, parents who don't really want to know the whole story, you know. Yeah. It's kind of like if they do that, then it really is true. They can kind of imagine that their child's somewhere just not there. And it's a very, very scary. And, you know, the thought that a parent doesn't leave the earth before their child is very difficult, too. And then they start blaming themselves why. And, you know, I think you going in and, I mean, talking about feeling like she's going to, you know, step out around the corner and, you know, maybe surprise you or scare you. And then, you know, that you just kind of imagine that, you know, when you've lost somebody like that. And I hear not that exact same thing, but I just know that I'm going to walk into her room or his room and he's going to be there. And not having that there. And you talked about it, you know, even when you got back to your home in Detroit, you know, talking about at the big house. Yeah. She's going to walk around the corner, you know.
I still feel like I sometimes see Miya. Like, I'll literally, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, I saw her walking down the street and I had to like run around the corner. And it's just like, it's like your mind's playing tricks on you, kind of. You want to believe it. You want to think that you're like in the Truman Show or something and they're really alive and this whole thing was like a trick, you know? I know that, you know, my mom wants to know everything, wants to talk about her all the time, wants her photos everywhere. My dad, complete opposite. He's never read my book. I still don't really think that he knows what I do every day for work. He doesn't, it's very, very hard for him. He doesn't want, you know, he doesn't want to deal with it in some ways. He kind of deals with it in certain destructive ways, but it's very hard to watch them. It's heartbreaking, you know, so.
And my curiosity is, as a psychologist, wants to know, have you talked to her ex-husband?
So we honestly, I think the case just technically is closing in a few days. Like her death anniversary is on the 14th because they keep it open for 10 years. There was a full, like, you know, kind of like death investigation about it because it didn't really make sense in terms of time frame. I go through the book pretty intensely with trying to, you know, work with the detective and figure out, is it possible? So she hung herself, most, you know, and it's, I think sometimes like when you hear that and you kind of picture it, it's a very violent act. And, you know, it's suicide, but it's one thing to take a bunch of pills and it's another thing to hang yourself. And, I have seen him. We don't talk to him at all. He's actually married to a girl that he was friends with, or that my sister was friends with in Gunnison. They live elsewhere now. They have kids. And the girl, interesting enough, a few months after Miya died, my two other sisters went to Colorado to pick up her dog. And they hung out with the girl, who would soon be his wife. And she said, I saw the signs. I could see how abusive he was to her. I was in a relationship very similar to that. And then somehow, because he's very, very charming and just very, you know, he can kind of manipulate it. I have no doubt that their dynamic and their relationship now is very similar. You don't just change overnight. And so I feel for this woman, you know, she's most likely an abused wife, period. I know that he had a history of that with almost every other relationship. I just think that my sister, because she was married to him and because of her past and a lot of struggle, she just took it to the extreme of this is never going to get better. So we don't talk with him at all. He is literally, I think if my dad saw him, he would try to strangle him, to be quite honest. So
I can understand that feeling.
Yeah.
The other thing that kind of caught me was you're the youngest, and then all of a sudden you're in charge of writing her eulogy. How was that? I mean, I know I lost my father and had to go through some of that process, and it was like, wow, this why me kind of thing,
Yeah, before she died, I was studying writing at college. It just kind of happened that was a lot of the classes that were required for the writing seminars degree at Hopkins was stuff I enjoyed, but I never really was like, I'm a writer. And I just remember being on the plane after we picked up her body and just writing. And it wasn't even like I think that my mom knew I was a decent writer, and it was just kind of like, oh, Sabrina's writing her eulogy, period. My other two sisters were kind of pissed about it. I talk a lot about that dynamic in the book. It wasn't a very, uplifting experience, around her funeral. I just wanted something that really, I don't know. I was so kind of numb at that point that I just kind of did it. And I felt a lot of pride for being able to read that for her. But yeah, I guess when I look back, I was so young that, I was 21 years old at that time. You just kind of do it, you
right.
just kind of, you kind of go into a, automatic response, and you just kind of do what you know, and that was what I knew.
So it wasn't, because one of my thoughts was, well, maybe it was therapeutic. It doesn't even sound like it was that. It was just something that had to be done.
It was therapeutic, but I didn't process it like that at the time. I just wanted, I just didn't, honestly, I was terrified that I would forget her. So I just started writing, and then it kind of was like, oh, I'm writing this eulogy. Okay, this is, and a lot of it at her funeral, the rabbi actually did a whole speech about how she was broken because she was bipolar, and it was so opposite of what Miya was. She was so together and just and very clear and not up and down in that way. She would get depressed here and, but it wasn't like she wasn't all over the place. And so looking back, I just felt very, very grateful that I had the opportunity to kind of paint a different picture for everyone at the funeral. Because it didn't really define her. And that's a lot of the struggle and the stigma of mental illness, is that people, oh, she's bipolar. Oh, he's borderline. Oh, he's this. Oh, she's that. And then you wrap yourself around that idea, and then that becomes the reason for something, where there's so many other situations that play into, a suicide or, bad decisions or whatever they are. The eulogy, again, it was really just, I was just kind of on autopilot, and it was really almost like a selfish thing, I think. If I really kind of dig into that memory, I was just really scared I would forget her overnight. So I just wrote it all down.
And it sounds like, you telling me that, every once in a while, you said a few months ago, you thought you saw her, that kind of stuff. It may be, and I hear it in your voice, that you're continuing to keep her alive through your story and through the things that you do. And I think it's a little different at the hospitals I work at. I have people who may have had full lives, and they're dying at the end of their lives, and it's a different kind of reaction from the families, and they kind of let things go. And in some ways you've let things go, but in other ways you've lifted it up and made it a bigger part of who you are to honor her.
100%. I think that's and I see that with a lot of friends, whether it's suicide or something else, any kind of death. It's, I remember a family friend, one of my mom's friends, had said to her maybe like 2-3 months after Miya died, like, she's gone, you just have to move on. And it doesn't really work like that. It's like, I mean, that was like, it's your daughter or your sister or someone that was such a, huge part of your life. And literally everything I do is mostly because of Miya. My blog, speaking at, like I'm speaking next week at a conference. It's a suicide prevention conference. I wouldn't be there trying to share a story to help people that may be suicidal or maybe dealing with a lost one if Miya hadn't died. Right. I wouldn't be doing I think honestly my life would be I would be like living in Australia. I don't even know what I'd be doing. Everything I do is because of her. Yeah, it's just, I mean, I don't know. I was, it helped in a way ground me. But I've taken it very I deal with it very differently. And in many ways, honestly, I still feel like even though I'm together, I'm still grieving every day. And maybe that's somewhat because I deal with it constantly in my writing. And that also might be just the way that, I'm not very good at ignoring things. And I think that when you ignore it, eventually it comes up and then it manifests in not very healthy, pretty destructive ways. So again, something that I kind of, that was a lot of the purpose of Mush Girls Love was, just I want to really like deal with this. I don't want to ignore it. And then in 30 years, realize, that's why I'm not in a relationship or why I'm killing myself or I'm beating my children or whatever, like those emotions bring up.
Exactly. Now, earlier you mentioned humor. And, when you're talking about death and dying, it's oftentimes kind of hard to put those together. But I just lost my grandmother a few weeks ago, and she was,
sorry to hear that.
She was one of those people that she could find something to smile or laugh about no matter how bad things got. And I think I got a lot of my humor from her. And it's hard for people to understand that, but I think it helped her have an amazing 96 years because life isn't always, a bed of roses. You have to deal with everything. And if you can find that positive, how do you think, tell me a little bit about where that comes from for you.
Yeah. First off, I kind of always hate when people are like, I'm so sorry. It is what it is. But, I feel I was very close with my grandfathers and I know what that feels like. But the humor, death is not like an easy topic and it brings up a lot of sadness, but the humor always comes from me. It's thinking about and remembering like stupid stories that someone did, like sometimes I'll think about my sister and my mom were driving back from Colorado on a road trip or something. And my mom drove away from the gas station with the thing still in the car and completely like ripped out the entire, and it's just like those stupid stories that you think about with about that person as opposed to only thinking about her at the coroner's office and, how devastated I feel. You latch on to good memories. Like, yes, someone's gone, but you can still enjoy who they were, Miya used to annoy the shit out of me half the time, changing her outfits 1,000 times and calling me 50 times in a day until I picked up because she wanted me to, wanted to tell me a story. And you think about that stuff and you make jokes about it when you're talking about that person. That for me is kind of where the humor comes in. And it does. It kind of keeps them alive in a certain way because it makes their personality, it doesn't feel like it's lost. It's still kind of part of you.
And that's, that's something that I relate to a lot, and it's interesting because my grandmother was in Colorado. We just had to go up there and deal with all of that too. So it's funny how that kind of comes back at me. But how can my listeners find out about you? I know we're going to post your website on the info on the show, but what are some things you can do, and how can they get a hold of you if they want to talk with you or maybe have you come speak?
Yeah, so almost everything is linked on my website. It's just SabrinaMust.com. My last name is Must, like you must write it down. I have my email address on there. I have links to my social media. I'm always love hearing from people. You know, there's links to reading my book on Amazon. You can also always just Google, Sabrina Must, Must Girls Love, memoir or something, and it should pop up. And, speaking, it's important to me, even though I'm a writer, I do think there's a lot of beauty in being able to be face-to-face with an audience and have them see you and see all forms of the emotion and really give space for sharing and feeling open about something that's pretty painful. So I really enjoy speaking engagements. It's something that, I want to do even more of. But everything is on my website, so that's pretty much the easiest way to reach out to me.
All right. Well, I really want to thank you for coming on and sharing. This is very personal. I'm going to continue reading, and I recommend that everybody that they can get a copy of this book, that they should, especially if you've ever lost somebody, not just to suicide, but just death and dying, going through that process. Yeah. I think it's very heartfelt and a rational experience that I think we all learn from. So,
well, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on our show.
Thanks for having me. Yes, thank you so much.
No worries. Okay, everyone, that concludes today's edition of Mainstream Mental Health Radio. Special thanks to our guest, Sabrina Must. To learn more about our show, visit us at mainstreammentalhealth.org. And thank you very much for coming and listening. And I'll see you here next week. And remember, life is what happens while you're making plans, so buckle up.
Thanks for listening to Mainstream Mental Health Radio with your host, Dr. John Huber. Check us out on social media, Google+, Mainstream Mental Health, Instagram @Mainstream Mental Health, Twitter @Mainstream MENTL, and search for Mainstream Mental Health on Facebook. Please tune in every week to Mainstream Mental Health Radio with your host, Dr. John Huber.